a conflict of ideology. A conflict which went for a very long time. And this conflict's effects still linger to this day. No, not that one. There we go. The Malayan Emergency was a conflict that happened earlier on in the Cold War. And even though this conflict has a lot of similarities with the Vietnam War, it's often overlooked when looking at events that happened during the Cold War. Probably because the Malayan Emergency was on a much smaller scale than the Vietnam War, and it received a lot less coverage. And that's a shame really, because after I'd read all the information on this topic, I really thought that this conflict was just as interesting as the Vietnam War. So, let's learn about it. Before Malaysia existed, it was a series of British colonies, and one of these colonies was known as the Federation of Malaya. Malaya had a large Chinese population, and the majority of these people worked in British plantations, and because they were seen as foreigners, they were mistreated by not only the British colonial authorities, but also by the Malayan population. The Malayan Communist Party was formed in 1930 in opposition to British rule in Malaya, and they campaigned for Malayan independence. But an important thing to note is that most people who supported the Communist Party were Chinese, not Malayans. But the Malayans weren't fond of the British either, so tensions were high. Then everything changed when the Japanese nation attacked. In 1942, the Japanese Empire invaded Malaya. Realising that there was going to be no help coming to them, the British decided to team up with the Communists to fight the Japanese. The British fought with the Communists against the Japanese until 1945, when Japan surrendered in World War II. The Communists tried to take over Malaya after the war, but they were stopped by the British. The British forced the Communists to disband their army that they had been using to fight the Japanese. And after that, the Communists kept campaigning for Malayan independence while the British kept suppressing them. Tensions were high once again, and it was almost like nothing had changed. On the 16th of June 1948, 3 British plantation managers were killed by Communist Party members. In response to these killings, the British enacted a state of emergency and declared emergency measures where the police were given powers to arrest any suspected communists in Malaya. This basically made the Malayan Communist Party illegal in Malaya, and many of the party's members were arrested by the police. Many of the remaining members that weren't arrested retreated into the Malayan jungle, and the leader of the Communist Party, Chin Peng, ordered the creation of the Malayan National Liberation Army, or MNLA if you're not a show-off. The British saw this as a revolt, and they quickly deployed 10,000 troops to crush the communists. The Malayan Emergency has just begun. The MNLA started by conducting sabotage, attacking plantations, and destroying infrastructure. The colonial forces didn't know how to fight a freely moving enemy in the jungle. And it didn't help that the people that were living in the jungle supported the communists and gave them food, shelter, and supplies. The British Army's Director of Operations, General Sir Harold Briggs, was appointed to Malaya, and he came up with a plan. He stated that the best way to defeat the communists would be to cut them off from their supporters. So the British deported over 500,000 villagers into camps known as new villages, which were basically villages except they were guarded by British troops, to keep the villagers in and the communists out. And the plan worked. The communists were now severely weakened because their supply line just got taken away from them. And things got even worse for the communists when Australia and New Zealand joined the conflict on the side of the British. Both of these countries offered air and naval support alongside troops. The British also called in troops from their colonies of Fiji, Rhodesia and Kenya. And Australia, New Zealand and Britain began their bombing campaigns while the British started to use their SAS units in raids against the communist holdouts. By 1957, it became very clear to Chin Peng and the MNLA that they could not win this conflict. They only had 8,000 troops to fight the Commonwealth's 350,000 troops, but they refused to give up. They refused to admit defeat. They would fight to the very end. Later on in 1957, possibly remembering that the communists were fighting for Malayan independence, the British decided to give Malaya independence on the 31st of August. And this crushed communist morale. They were fighting for Malayan independence, but if it had already been given to them, then why would they need to fight? And from that point onwards, the MNLA began to collapse. Chin Peng gave the order for the communists to retreat into Thailand, which is where they would stay for the next 9 years. On the 31st of July 1960, the Malayan government declared that the state of emergency was over. Chin Peng left Thailand to head to China, where other Southeast Asian communist leaders were living. The conflict was over. Well, it was over for now at least.